The father's expression darkened. What? She glanced down at her phone, tapping the screen a few times before looking back up. According to records, there have been multiple anonymous calls over the past few months, all describing a suspicious man near the pool, near the clubhouse, even near his own home. The descriptions match you. A murmur spread through the crowd. The mother's grip on her children tightened as a sick realization settled over her. So someone has been watching us, calling the police on us. The father clenched his jaw. He had suspected something wasn't right, but hearing it confirmed hit differently. His presence wasn't just questioned today. This had been happening for a while. The woman from Internal Affairs gave him a knowing look. And it seems this time, the call wasn't as anonymous as they thought. The younger officer frowned. What do you mean? She turned her phone around, revealing a name on the screen. A name that made several people in the crowd gasp. Mrs. Caldwell. The father inhaled sharply. The same woman who had been accused of making similar calls before. The same woman who had watched his family with suspicion for months. And the worst part, she wasn't just a neighbor. She was on the Homeowners Association board. A stunned silence fell over the crowd. The name on the screen sent a ripple of shock through those gathered. But for the father, it wasn't surprising. It was confirmation. His jaw tightened, but he forced himself to stay calm. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, his confidence completely drained. Wait, the caller was on the HOA board. The woman from Internal Affairs nodded. Not only that, but records show she's made multiple complaints over the past year, always about the same so-called suspicious activity. And every time, it was you or someone in your family. The mother let out a sharp breath. So what happens now? Before anyone could answer, a voice rang out from the back. This is ridiculous. Heads turned as a woman stepped forward. Mrs. Caldwell. She was a middle-aged woman with perfectly styled hair, wearing oversized sunglasses, and a sun hat that barely hid the irritation on her face. I made those calls because I was concerned for the safety of this community, she snapped. The father turned toward her, his expression unreadable. Concerned? About what exactly? She hesitated, but then lifted her chin. I didn't recognize you, and I have every right to report people who seem out of place. A murmur spread through the crowd. Several neighbors exchanged uncomfortable glances. Some looked away, embarrassed. Others were watching her with barely contained disbelief. The mother's voice cut through the air like a blade. Out of place. We live here. Mrs. Caldwell let out a huff. Well, how was I supposed to know that? The woman from Internal Affairs gave her a pointed look. The same way you know everyone else who lives here. The same way you've never called the police on any of the other families using this pool. Mrs. Caldwell opened her mouth, but nothing came out. The weight of her actions was finally pressing down on her. The father took a slow step forward, his voice low but firm. You called the police on me in my own neighborhood. You put my family at risk because you didn't recognize us. And today, these officers nearly arrested me in front of my children because of you. A hush settled over the crowd. Mrs. Caldwell swallowed hard, suddenly aware of how many eyes were on her. Her confident posture wavered. I was just trying to keep the neighborhood safe, she muttered, her voice smaller now. The father didn't take his eyes off her. No, you were trying to decide who belongs. And you got it wrong. The officers were silent. The younger one, now looking entirely out of place, shifted uncomfortably. He had acted without thinking, without questioning, and now he was standing in the middle of a situation that had spiraled far beyond his control. The woman from Internal Affairs finally broke the silence. Mrs. Caldwell, I'm going to need you to come with me. The older officer frowned. Wait, she's not being arrested, is she? The internal affairs agent gave him a sharp look. She made multiple false reports. That's an abuse of emergency services. She turned back to the father. And as for you, Captain, if you want to file an official complaint, you have every right to. The father exhaled slowly. His anger hadn't faded, but he knew there was nothing more to say. The truth was out. The damage had been done. But now, finally, there would be consequences. One by one, people started speaking up, some hesitant, others more direct. It was clear that not everyone around the pool had been comfortable with what was happening. But now, with the truth out in the open, the energy in the space was shifting. The father exhaled slowly, watching the officers' reactions. They were stuck now, caught between their mistake and the reality of the situation. He could see them running through their options in their minds: how to de-escalate without admitting fault, how to walk away without looking weak. But this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The father stood his ground, his steady gaze locked on the officers. The sun beat down on the pavement, but the chill between them was undeniable. The officers, still trying to process what had just happened, seemed unsure of their next move. The air was thick with tension, but beneath that, something else was bubbling. A quiet storm of emotions, questions, and unspoken truths. The younger officer, the one who had been so quick to act, cleared his throat. "Look, sir, we don't want any trouble here. Like I said, we were responding to a call." The father tilted his head slightly, his voice measured. "And who made that call?" The officers exchanged a look, hesitation flashing between them. The truth was, they didn't know. The call had come in as an anonymous report, someone complaining about unauthorized individuals at the pool. But now, standing in front of a man who outranked them in the very profession they claimed to serve, they were realizing just how reckless their approach had been. The mother shook her head, her frustration evident. "So someone calls, says they see people they think don't belong, and you just show up ready to arrest us. No questions, no investigation, nothing." A few of the bystanders shifted uncomfortably. Some of them had been silently watching, unsure of whether to get involved. Now, with the truth unraveling in real time, the weight of their silence felt heavier. A voice from the side suddenly spoke up, an older man, standing near the poolside chairs. It was Mrs. Caldwell, wasn't it? The officers turned toward the voice, surprised. The man continued, his voice steady but laced with disapproval. "She's called security on my grandson before. Said he looked suspicious walking home from the clubhouse." He shook his head. "That woman has a history of making calls like this." Murmurs spread through the crowd. A few heads nodded in agreement. Others exchanged uneasy glances, as if they suddenly realized the pattern that had been playing out in their own neighborhood for years. The father's jaw tightened. He had spent his entire career enforcing the law, ensuring that justice was served fairly. Yet here he was, standing on the other side of it, being treated as a suspect, as if his very presence was a crime. And the worst part, his children had just witnessed it all. The older child, a boy around 10, finally spoke up, his voice small but clear. "Daddy, if you're a police officer too, why did they still try to arrest you?" The question hit harder than any accusation could. The father glanced down at his son, his heart heavy. How was he supposed to explain something like this? How could he tell his children that no matter how much good he tried to do, some people would still only see him one way? One of the officers shifted uncomfortably. He looked at the father, then at the boy, then back at his partner. This was spiraling out of control in a way they hadn't anticipated. They had come here expecting a simple situation: walk in, handle the problem, and leave. But now they were standing in the middle of something much bigger. The father took a slow breath, his voice calm but firm. You see, son, sometimes people judge before they know the truth. They assume things based on what they think they see, instead of asking questions first. The boy frowned. But that's not fair. No, the father agreed, his eyes never leaving the officers. It's not. The crowd had grown, more people standing around now, listening, watching. The weight of what had just happened was sinking in for everyone. The officers looked at each other, realizing they had walked straight into a storm they weren't prepared for. And the storm wasn't over yet. The younger officer shifted on his feet, his face now a mix of unease and frustration. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. He had walked into this situation with full authority, confident in his role, but now, standing in front of a seasoned police captain, in front of a growing crowd, he was starting to feel exposed. The weight of his mistake was setting in, and he didn't know how to fix it. It was supposed to be a fun, relaxing day at the community pool. The sun was shining, kids were laughing, and families were enjoying a break from the summer heat. But for one Black family, what started as a peaceful afternoon quickly turned into a nightmare they never saw coming. A mother, father, and their 2 kids had just settled in, laying out towels, unpacking snacks, and getting ready to swim, when things took an unexpected turn. A few sideways glances from other poolgoers quickly escalated into whispers. Then within minutes, uniformed officers stormed in. They walked straight toward the family, their expressions serious, their presence undeniable. The father, a tall, calm man in his late 40s, instinctively stepped forward, placing himself between the officers and his family. He had seen this before, heard the stories, watched the videos. But now it was happening to him. Sir, we got a call about trespassers in the pool, one officer said, his voice firm, his hand resting on his belt. Trespassing? The mother looked around in disbelief. We live here. We have a membership. But the officers weren't listening. They demanded IDs, accused the family of not belonging, and within moments, things escalated. One officer reached for his cuffs. The kids clung to their mother, their young faces filled with fear. Sir, put your hands behind your back, the officer ordered, moving in closer. The father took a deep breath, keeping his voice steady. Are you sure you want to do this? He asked. The officers scoffed. You're resisting now. One of them snapped. And then with a calm yet powerful tone, the father said the words that changed everything. I'm a police captain. Silence. The officers froze. The air around them shifted. What happened next would shock everyone. Officers, bystanders, and even the people who made the call in the first place. Stay tuned, because this story is just getting started. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. The officers' expressions shifted from confidence to confusion, their hands hesitating over their gear. The people standing around the pool had stopped whatever they were doing, their eyes locked on the scene unfolding before them. The only sounds were the distant splash of water and the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. The officer closest to the father narrowed his eyes. What did you just say? His voice had lost some of its earlier edge, but the tension was still there. I'm a police captain, the father repeated, his voice calm but firm. And I think you just made a serious mistake. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across the officers' faces. One of them took a step back, exchanging a quick look with his partner. They hadn't expected this. In their minds, this was just another routine call, a complaint from a resident about suspicious activity at the pool. They had shown up assuming guilt, not bothering to ask questions first. The mother held onto their 2 children, her grip protective. She knew her husband was staying calm for their sake, but she could see the anger in his eyes. Not the kind of anger that explodes, but the kind that simmers, deep and controlled. He had spent years in law enforcement. He had trained officers just like these men. He knew exactly how this game was played, and he knew how dangerous it could become. One of the officers finally cleared his throat. "Look, sir, we were just responding to a call. Someone reported trespassers in the pool area. We have to check it out." The father tilted his head slightly. "And did you check before you started making accusations? Did you ask anyone here if we belonged? Did you look at the pool membership list?" The younger officer, the one who had first reached for his cuffs, suddenly seemed unsure. "Well, no, but you assumed," the father finished for him. His voice was still even, but the weight of his words hung in the air. "You saw a black family enjoying a public space, and you assumed we didn't belong." A nervous hush spread through the bystanders. Some people looked uncomfortable, others avoided eye contact altogether. A few had the decency to look guilty. The mother finally spoke up, her voice carrying just enough force to cut through the awkward silence. "Our key card was used to enter the pool. Our address is registered here. Our kids play with half the children in this neighborhood. And yet, someone still thought we were trespassing." The officers shifted uncomfortably. The tension had started to turn back on them, and they could feel it. The weight of their mistake was settling in, but they weren't sure how to handle it. Then one of the bystanders, a woman in a sun hat and sunglasses, spoke up. "I was here when they arrived. They didn't do anything wrong." Another voice chimed in. "Yeah, they live here. I've seen them before." Mrs. Caldwell's face paled. "Wait, this is a misunderstanding." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, but no one stepped forward to defend her. The very people she had claimed to be protecting were now watching her with judgment in their eyes. The younger officer cleared his throat, then turned to the father. "Sir, I'm sorry. We got this wrong." His voice was hesitant, but there was real regret in it. The father studied him for a long moment before nodding. "You did." The officer looked down, ashamed. His partner stayed silent, his own regret written across his face. The father turned to his wife, reaching for her hand. Their children were still watching, wide-eyed, absorbing everything. He knew this moment would stay with them forever. He gave them a small, reassuring nod. "Let's go home." As they walked away, the weight of what had happened still lingered in the air. The conflict had reached its boiling point, and the truth had finally been exposed. But as the family left the pool, hand in hand, one thing was clear: this was more than just a confrontation. It was a wake-up call. As the father and his family walked away from the pool, a strange silence followed them. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the pavement. His son, still holding his hand, looked up at him with a question in his eyes, but didn't say anything. The father squeezed his hand gently, offering silent reassurance. There would be plenty of time to talk later, to explain things in a way that made sense. Right now, they just needed to be together. Behind them, the scene at the pool was still unfolding. Mrs. Caldwell stood frozen in place, her usual air of superiority gone. The crowd had thinned, but those who remained were whispering among themselves, exchanging uneasy glances. The truth had been laid bare, and there was no going back from it. The younger officer, still shaken, finally let out a breath he had been holding. He turned to his partner, guilt written all over his face. "We really messed this up." The older officer gave a slow nod. "Yeah, we did." He glanced toward internal affairs, then at Mrs. Caldwell, before turning back to his partner. "This is going to follow us for a long time." The younger officer looked down, realizing how close he had come to making an even bigger mistake. He had nearly escalated a situation without cause. And now it was clear just how dangerous that could have been. Back at their house, The father and mother sat together in the quiet living room, the kids upstairs. The weight of the day was finally settling in. The mother shook her head, rubbing her temples. "I keep thinking about how different this could have gone," she admitted. The father exhaled, leaning back into the couch. "Me too." She looked at him. What now? He thought about it for a long moment. He had spent years in law enforcement, working to uphold justice, to protect people. And yet today, his own family had needed protection from the very system he believed in. He wasn't sure what to do with that yet, but he knew one thing: staying silent wasn't an option. "We file a report," he finally said. "We hold them accountable." She nodded, relief flickering across her face. Good. The next few days were filled with conversations. Internal affairs followed up. The department launched an internal review, and the HOA was forced to confront the behavior of one of their own. Mrs. Caldwell resigned from the board, though she never issued an apology. The officers involved were required to undergo additional training, and changes were promised within the department. But beyond the official actions, something else happened. The neighborhood changed. People started paying attention in a way they hadn't before. Conversations that had once been avoided were now being had. And while things weren't perfect, there was a shift, small but real. One evening, as the father walked outside with his son, they passed the pool again. It was quiet now, peaceful. The boy looked up at him. "Daddy, do you think things will get better?" The father smiled, resting a hand on his son's shoulder. "If we keep pushing for it," he said, "they will." And with that, they walked forward together. The father kept his hands relaxed at his sides, but his presence filled the space. He wasn't just standing up for himself. He was standing up for his family, for his children, and for everyone who had ever been in this situation before. He could feel the stares of the onlookers, some filled with guilt, others with anger, but none of them looking away. This was no longer just an incident at a pool. It was something bigger. The mother, still holding onto their youngest child, exhaled sharply. "So what now?" she asked, her voice controlled but firm. "Are you going to arrest my husband for existing? For bringing his kids to swim?" The older officer, who had been quiet up until now, finally spoke. His voice was lower, as if he was choosing his words carefully. "Look, I think maybe we should step back and reassess." But the younger officer wasn't ready to let go that easily. His pride was on the line now. His jaw tightened as he turned toward the father. "If you're a police captain, where's your badge?" A slow, almost knowing smile crossed the father's face. He had been waiting for that moment. Without breaking eye contact, he reached into his back pocket and pulled out his wallet. He flipped it open, revealing his badge and ID. The official insignia caught the sunlight, unmistakable in its authority. The crowd murmured, and the officers stiffened. The younger officer's face paled slightly as he read the name and the title. It was real. He was real. And they had just tried to arrest a high-ranking officer without even verifying basic information. The father let the silence stretch between them. He wanted them to sit in their own discomfort, to feel the weight of what they had just done. Then, in a voice steady and unwavering, he asked, "Now do you believe I belong here?" The younger officer swallowed hard, but didn't respond. He couldn't. His partner, however, cleared his throat and took a step back. "Sir, we may have misjudged the situation." The father gave a single nod, his expression unreadable. "No," he said, "you didn't misjudge the situation. You acted on an assumption. And that assumption could have ended very differently." The tension was at its peak now. The mother's grip on their children tightened. The crowd stood frozen, waiting to see what would happen next. The officers had lost control of the narrative, and they knew it. Now, all they could do was brace for the fallout. The older officer exhaled slowly, his gaze shifting between his partner and the father. He knew they had made a mistake, a big one. But just as he opened his mouth to offer some kind of apology, something unexpected happened. From behind the crowd, a new voice cut through the thick silence. "Excuse me, officers." Heads turned as a woman in a crisp navy blue blazer pushed her way forward. Her presence alone sent a ripple through the crowd. She was in her mid-40s, confident, and carried herself like someone who was used to being in charge. But it wasn't just her appearance that caught everyone's attention. It was the unmistakable badge clipped to her waist. The mother's eyes narrowed. Who is she? The father recognized the woman instantly, though he hadn't expected to see her here. Internal affairs, he muttered under his breath. The younger officer stiffened. The color drained from his face as he quickly straightened his posture. He had been in the department long enough to know that when internal affairs showed up, it was never a good sign. The woman, her expression unreadable, stepped directly between the officers and the father. "Captain," she addressed him, acknowledging his rank with a small nod before turning to the officers. "Which one of you initiated this response?" Neither officer spoke. The younger one shifted nervously, looking anywhere but at her. The older officer hesitated, then finally muttered, "We both responded to the call." "That's not what I asked," she shot back, her voice sharp. She turned her attention fully to the younger officer. "Did you confirm the report before attempting an arrest?" He swallowed hard. "No, ma'am. We acted on the information given." "And did you verify his identity before reaching for your cuffs?" she pressed. The silence that followed was deafening. The younger officer opened his mouth, but no words came out. He didn't have an excuse, not one that would hold up. The tension had just reached an entirely new level. The father watched the scene unfold, his face unreadable. He had been in law enforcement long enough to know when a situation was about to take a sharp turn, and this was one of those moments. The woman from Internal Affairs turned toward him. "Captain, were you aware that this wasn't the first complaint made about your presence in this neighborhood?"